Hey guys, Landon from Redefined Horizons, and in this video I'm going to give you just a quick summary of some issues that we ran into on a recent survey we did. This is for an agricultural parcel in eastern San Joaquin County out on Highway 4, and it's just a good example of some of the problems you can have in more rural areas in my part of Central California, and some of the issues that can come up when you're going to buy or sell agricultural land. And my partner and I, we work with farmers on a pretty regular basis, and I thought this would be a good chance just to let people know why they should have a good land surveyor take a look at property, especially rural property, anytime they're going to buy or sell. So let me give you some background. So this is several hundred acres of land, so it's bits and pieces of several sections. It hasn't been surveyed in over 150 years, so no survey done since the original General Land Office surveys came through in the late 1800s. And we got involved for just a small task on this project, so the client needed an easement, and we were working with them on that. And so we got in, we did some research, pulled some records, started looking at some different things, and we found there were 4 major problems that we found with this particular large ag parcel. So what were the problems? Number one, they didn't know how much land they own. So none of the corners of the parcel were marked. None of them had been monumented since the late 1800s. And there were, they just didn't know. They didn't know where the boundaries were. They didn't know what their acreage was. And, they were in a bad spot there. And we let the client know, hey, property hasn't been surveyed. We can't really tell you what you have. They were asking us questions about, where the boundaries were, and could we give them some kind of sketch of how much land they had. And the answer to that question was no, not unless you pay for a survey, because there's just not enough information in the record. A second problem was their grant deed contained an access easement that was no longer on the ground. So when this parcel, the land description for this farmland parcel was originally created, there weren't as many public roads in this part of the county. So there was a long access easement to get from these parcels to the public road. And in the meantime, the parcel had been chunked off and subdivided and chopped up. And so this deed actually contained an access easement that was no longer on the ground. And so you might say, well, who cares? What's the issue? In theory, if they were to sell that parcel to me, for example, and I could technically go back and make a claim against the seller or the seller's or my title insurance company, because I was supposed to have an access easement that I didn't have, right? So I was sold something in my deed that they didn't actually have to give me, and so that can cause problems. Another issue was there were several parcels in this farmland, this ag ranch, I guess you could call it, that were landlocked, so they had no legal access to a public road. That's okay as long as they were together as a unit, in theory, because one of the parcels did have some legal access. They had an easement over the neighbor's property to get to a public road. You can get into some issues there with overburdening the easement, but in theory, to keep things simple, as long as those parcels were bought or sold as a unit, they would have access to a public road. But in theory, those parcels could be sold. Some of those parcels could have been sold as units. So this was a larger kind of land holding that was made up of 4 or 5 individual parcels, legal parcels. And in theory, those legal parcels could have been sold. And you got to be really careful when you do that, because if you sell a landlocked parcel, it's a good way to get sued. So again, that was an issue with the grant deed. And then finally, the other thing was a few years back, about 10 years ago, the client had sold off a big chunk of this, about a third of this landholding they sold off. And because they didn't understand the way public lands legal description works, and we call them aliquot, surveyors call them aliquot descriptions, they actually created an illegal subdivision. So they severed one or more of their legal lots and sold that to the neighbor. And they didn't go through the formal subdivision process, which is a requirement here in California. So in theory, at some point, somebody out there could be in trouble for having a legal subdivision. If they did, they went into the county to pull a building permit, or do something else like a subdivision or a lot merger. They could be told that they don't have a legal lot. They could have to go through a certificate of compliance process. There could be other issues. So that's never good. Illegal subdivisions are never a good thing. And that's what happens when people try and subdivide land without the help of a good land surveyor. So what are some solutions that we offered the client in this situation? First thing we told them was you need to get a survey. You need to get a survey of your land holding, understand what you own, how many legal lots you have. You need to have us write you a corrected legal description, land description for your deed. We need to file a corrective deed, get a good description of your property in the record so that if you ever go to sell, you're not selling something you don't own. And finally, we need to work with you and your neighbor to get a certificate of compliance on that illegal subdivision that you created so that you don't have legal liability for that moving forward. Unfortunately, the client in this case, which is a fairly big corporation, declined to get our help with any of those things, which was disappointing. They've left those problems. They left those problems out there, and potentially some buyer of the property out there at some point in the future is they're gonna inherit a rat's nest, and that's too bad. That's a sad thing. So, anyways, you got to be careful when you're buying and selling rural property in California, and you really need to work with a good land surveyor. Have a land surveyor look at your deed. Have them look at your title report. There is a 95% likelihood that my partner and I could have caught all these problems before a sale just by looking at a deed and a title report and checking some of our local survey records. So don't buy agricultural property without the help of a good land surveyor. If you're in Central California or Western Nevada and you're going to buy some rural property, reach out to me and my partner. We can help you find problems and prevent them.